Okay, and we're off. Excellent. So I'd like to welcome Paul Vincent and Scott Brewer from Randstad Sourceright. Really pleased to have you guys joining me today. We're going to be talking about some interesting topics framed around the title of Services Procurement MSP, Obstacles, Evolution and Opportunities. Now, I know we've all got loads to say in this area, but we kind of try and structure it around a few key areas. And with the three of us on the call, I'll try and divert questions here and there as appropriate. But to start off with, really appreciate you guys joining me. Scott, start with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me here on the call. So SOW and services procurement is a passion of mine and Paul, so we're always glad to talk about it. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure. And Paul, how are you?
Very good today. This is week 6 of my Randstad journey, so it's interesting time to be talking to you.
Yeah, all change on your side. In fact, while we're on the subject, so you two have come together. You're both experts in this world, but you both come from I'd say slightly different angles within the same context. Paul, starting with you, can you just give me a little bit of a kind of a potted history of your journey through the sort of services procurement kind of services delivered around services procurement, just your journey through the market and how you actually got to where you are now and the changes that you've just gone through?
Yeah, no, sure. So, I mean, I've been, to be honest, in and around the services procurement arena for most of my career, but I've had 3 distinct phases. The first phase was 20 odd years in BT Group, which is a telecoms company in the UK. And about 60% of my time in that organization were in procurement roles, where I bought near enough everything, from consumer products for retail to telecoms infrastructure, but a lot of services elements was always part of whatever I was buying. My last corporate role from a procurement perspective in BT was to be the global procurement director for all forms of resourcing, temp, professional services, etc. In between times, I had a roving career in change management, business transformation, different types of operational roles where I had to be the client of different types of service providers. So that was my BT phase. Then I started my own consulting practice, and I had that for about 6 years, where I was helping companies on both sides of the equation to buy and sell services more on value than price, but I'd help service providers to become more differentiated in their offering. At the same time, I'd help procurement teams to just get better value and increase the influence and impact they had within their organizations. And then for the last 6 years, I've been in the workforce solutions arena. Kelly OCG to begin with, that was 3 years leading their product portfolio, then in Hayes for a couple of years, and now in Randstad. And I guess what makes me quite unusual as an SME in this environment is because I've sat in all those seats around the table. I do have that sort of empathy and understanding of what drives value. And I think that's really important as we get into the conversation today. It's really important about understanding that it's not just a process-driven solution, it's very much a value-driven solution.
Yeah, very true. And how did you kind of get pulled across into the workforce solution side of things? I guess the first entry point for that was when you were working with Kelly OCG.
Well, I had a number of clients at the time in the workforce arena, and Kelly were one of those early clients that I had. But I reached a point in my consulting career where, I had a really good, strong book of clients, but I was just missing something, just providing advice. I wanted to get back into the delivery part of the equation. And it was just coincidental that at the time I started looking, Kelly OCG approached me and asked if I was interested in that particular role. So it's more by coincidence than design. But when I was talking to Kelly about the nature of the role they wanted me to do, it was such a composite of everything I've done before. So the strategy for deploying workforce solutions, how you actually differentiate the value that the service providers in the supply chain can make, and obviously moving to a total talent environment where you're looking more strategically about how you deploy resources into your organization and get work done.
Yeah, so looking at it from that workforce solutions angle, and I'll come on to this with Scott as well, because I know, Scott's got a really great track record on this side, specifically around services procurement. But it's something that's kind of taken a while to really gain traction within that workforce solutions market. And it's interesting when you look at the kind of crossover, or how it's basically come together, where workforce solutions providers are being able to provide a more holistic service, where they're looking at all resource channels, including this giant one called services procurement. How have you kind of noticed that change over the journey that you've had?
Well, it's quite interesting. If I go back to that last role I had in BT, which was around 2007 to 9, I drove a big transformation project around how they deployed consulting companies and expenditure. And a big part of that project was being really clear what is actually consulting versus what is effectively additional capacity. Yeah. And that difference between capability and capacity is something that often can get confused for different types of services. And the more you bring clarity to what is it that the service provider is actually going to be delivering, the more you're obviously getting close to a services procurement type mentality, because it's much less about effort and much more about outcome. And so when you think about it from a consulting lens, then you have the way the market's evolved in the last few years. In that, to give you an example, I when I was consulting, I helped a company that delivered multifunctional devices, office machines, but they had a professional services arm that would do time and motion studies, for example, in the client office to see, well, what would be the distance between a person and then their nearest machine, and how could they improve that productivity? So the idea of a consulting advisory service has now become much more prevalent as part of all different types of sectors of the market. And it's not just consulting or the classic professional service. So I think those two things that have converged together to make it much more natural that you look at the entirety of your workforce and you're trying to put greater definition on what those contributors to your workforce are actually doing. So it's taken time, and I think there's still a fairly long way to go that it becomes the default position for many companies. But certainly it's a lot more of a natural thought process than it ever has been before.
Yeah, it's certainly logical to me when you're, an organization needs to know how to make the most effective use of all of their resources. And this is a clear, strong, big resource channel. And it's something that's become more and more important, as we can address later when we talk about some of the factors that have kind of pushed the growth of this type of work delivery. So that's super interesting. I really appreciate that. Scott, do you want to just give us a bit of a kind of a walkthrough of your background as well? Because you've been involved with the services procurement side, the statement of work side of things for a decent amount of time.
Yeah, for quite a while. So for about the last 13 years, I've been specialized in this space, and it's SOW and services procurement managed service programs. And so I've worked for a number of providers in that space. So I've been with Randstad Sourceright a little over 2.5 years now. Before that, I was with Pontoon. Before that, I was with Workforce Logic and Zero Chaos. And I've had the benefit of working with some really large programs within those different providers, and I've learned a lot. The interesting thing about my background is that early on, we had our own VMS. And so we delivered both the MSP and the VMS. So I've always had an eye for how best to leverage the technology in the solution. And initially, my background getting into services buying was with General Electric, where I was in operations finance. And one of the last positions I held is that we were responsible for buying and overseeing the craft labor for some of the turbines that were being installed at power plants. And so that's where I sort of cut my teeth in terms of buying agreements, getting to understand them, service level performance, and a lot of the worker element that comes along with it. And so it's just been a progression over time of, more exposure to larger deals and more companies over time. And it's been a great journey.
Yeah, and I'd imagine that through that process, where you've been working for these large staffing organizations or workforce solutions providers, how have you seen the emphasis on the importance of services procurement offerings change within those organizations over that time period?
Yeah, it became a burning platform for the stakeholders that we were involved with. And I always liken it to the fact that we sometimes reported under talent acquisition or HR, or sometimes in procurement. And we were providing things on the staff augmentation side in terms of worker visibility or rate management. And they were looking at this giant amount on their P&L, this growing services procurement spend. And I think they were saying to themselves, I want the same discipline. I want the same visibility and structure for that. And I think that's how it evolved. And I think the VMSs saw that opportunity too. They started expanding and building in services procurement functionality. I think the MSPs came along with them, and it became a transactional to start with, but then I think it's evolved where companies are now saying, okay, now I've got this visibility over this beast that's growing in my P&L. I need someone to help me manage it and optimize it. So it grew out of necessity, and then I think it's just taking off from here. And it's the thing that's changed over the years is, like 8 years ago, you'd see mention of an SOW in an RFP, be like one question or two questions. Well, now it's an entire section. It's a growing need for the clients that we support, and they realize that they need a solution for it. So it's a little bit of a match made in heaven if you can position yourself properly.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So obviously with the two of you coming together at Randstad, it's an interesting opportunity to obviously kind of share the benefits of your slightly different backgrounds and kind of slightly different routes in. Scott, I'll start with you. Just in terms of, obviously, you guys have only been working together for a relatively short period of time so far, but do you feel there are any things that you've specifically been able to benefit from or take from Paul's background? Obviously, you're kind of based in different geographies, but kind of used to dealing with global type roles. Are there any particular things that you've been able to kind of benefit from or learn from Paul's specific background?
Yeah. Well, now I don't have to compete against him, which is nice. That's probably been one of the bigger benefits. But no, it's been great. So the experience that Paul went through in terms of his years in procurement, to me, it's reinforced the value proposition and the voice of procurement. So deeper understanding of what they want, appreciation of what the mindset is. It's not always about the traditional pain points or levers that you think of. He's brought that, and he's really introduced some really good solutioning ideas very quickly and how to pique the interest of the stakeholders. And one thing that Paul's great about is creating that rallying cry around here's the solution and getting adoption and in passion and energized within the company for it. So it's been great so far.
Yeah, I think it's that's really interesting because I think you've just got to try and make it easy for companies to do this, because I think sometimes they can quite easily be scared off just with the size, the challenge of it, and how am I going to get my arms around this? It's such a big thing. There's going to be so many stakeholders involved. It's global, and so I think if there's the ability to make things easier for organisations, then it's a great way to get started. Paul, how about you? Obviously, with what Scott's been doing in the industry for a good length of time, he's had great line of sight on these specific types of offerings. How's that work from your point of view in terms of being able to leverage his background experience?
Well, I mean, being very honest, I mean, the opportunity to work with Scott and leverage that expertise was one of the draws of why I've come to Randstad. I mean, I think when Mike Smith, the CEO, started talking to me about his ambition for what he wanted to do, that was a big part of the proposition. How to really accelerate the work that had already been done. And yes, it's only been a few weeks working together, but you can really see that blend of that deep technology-led sort of MSP-driven service offering, alongside what I've been able to bring by way of that kind of stakeholder perspective. I think being almost candid with you and the audience, I think also when you have a role like Scott and I have had independently, it's a bit bipolar, because you've got the need to be externally focused on how best to position to a market that itself is going through change. You need to really clarify to them what are the benefit story and why should they choose your particular organization. And of course, the biggest question is, why do anything? How to get started. But then the internal focus is, how do you encourage your organization to think differently? Because we're dealing with people who are very used to a traditional MSP program and structure, and ask from the stakeholders. And so you're constantly having that two-way perspective, and that's why it feels bipolar. And it's a hard job, and it's hard to do everything properly. And so the opportunity for us to work together and really split that responsibility means that we are together a lot more powerful in being able to drive that change. And Scott's going to be very much driving that's end-to-end solution, and I'm going to be driving that outward positioning and packaging of how we add value to the organization. And you bring those two together, and it's a very, very powerful combination, and we can literally get more done.
Yeah, I think you're part of a fairly select club, you guys, in the sense that there aren't really that many people who are SMEs in this space. Certainly within the kind of workforce solutions industry, you're part of a really good club of some really smart people who are really good at what they do. But it's just like, when you sort of look at building out the teams and stuff like that, it must be quite difficult, because you've got to get people who really understand this side of it. And like you say, you're dealing with that internal versus external challenge. You need to have the expertise to be able to offer the service to your customers, but also you need to be able to fight the battles internally, where you're part of large organizations that make, have a heritage of a huge amount of business doing something that is significantly different enough to mean that there's going to be some crossover, but certain things that happen on this side of the business are not really that relevant to what happens over here. But from a client's point of view, you want to knit it all together and just basically provide them a solution that covers all of it. So I think it's interesting.
On that, sorry, I mean, Johnny, just coming on that point, I think the mentality has got to be different, because in a classic contingent environment, the job is to find talent and to work with all the various sources of that talent in the right way. But the job in SOW is not necessarily to find, it's to make sure the engagement part of the equation works really simply and really easily. And so that's a different dynamic. It's a different problem statement, and it's a different set of expectations from the client. And that's one of the things that you really have to help people to understand, that it's not an instead of, it's an and proposition, and it's complementary to what you're doing. But you do have to apply a different level of logic to understanding the customer requirement and actually delivering something around that.
Yeah, it's a very pertinent point, actually. And I think it applies, certainly it's something I recognize from a tech point of view, in the sense that, you're supporting the life cycle, you're optimizing the life cycle, and the aim is to optimize return on investment from services spend. It's not necessarily about an organization saying, how do I find a supplier for X? It's a question of saying, how do you optimize your supply chain? How do you maximize the benefits? How do you gain the visibility on what you're already doing and who you should be using within your services supply chain? So I think, we all probably agree we're in a relatively emerging market, still at a relatively early stage of the market around around organizations actually addressing services procurement effectively. Just be interested to understand a perspective from you guys on what you think the current services procurement market looks like in terms of what you're seeing. Scott, I'll start with you with that one, because I'd be interested to know what you're seeing at the moment and how you feel that's really significantly changed over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's influenced a lot by, I think, the market itself, or what's being bought. And so right now what we're seeing is the impact of skilled labor shortage impacting the suppliers that are in programs. So specifically IT firms they're fighting for talent right now. And a lot of those suppliers that provide IT services, they do just in time sourcing of those resources as well. So there's a pinch. What's going to happen is that the rates associated with that work is going to increase, or the rates are going to increase. And so what we're starting to see now is a shift towards more outcome-based engagements, so that the buyer is protected from that inflationary risk of that. And we saw that coming out of COVID anyway. During COVID, when a lot of SOW agreements were canceled, there was a big dispute in terms of how much work had been done versus how much was paid for. Again, another lesson learned for procurement. So that's what we're seeing now in terms of a structure. And I think we will with the labor shortage. Where that lends well is for a services procurement program, because in the technology and the program team itself, we help manage the deliverables, the structure associated with it. So it's more interest in the contract compliance piece of it and the delivery compliance of it. And that's been a growing need that we've seen. The other thing is IT is growing significantly. And I think gone are the days of people hiring those resources in-house to support that technology. They just can't do it. It's changing too much. So the world of buying external expertise is only going to go up from here. It may ebb and flow with the economy, but the percentage of what you invest your dollars in is always going to be external. So that's what we're seeing. It's going to grow. It's going to switch to more outcome-based engagements. A program like ours will help deliver that, and I think that's the way that the industry is going to move toward.
Yeah, really interesting. So, one of the things you mentioned there was about do you feel where do you feel the balance is in terms of what's required in the market when you look at this from a pre versus post contract stage?
You mean like in terms of the value add, Johnny, or like the compliance pieces? Can you
just
elaborate?
In terms of the value? Because if you look at the entire workflow from the the initial procurement through contracting and then through delivery, just from my own observation in the market, the post contract phase is, I think, probably where the biggest gap is. Now, clearly there are gaps in the kind of source to award and source to contract stage, but I feel that in some cases organizations kind of have a bit of a handle on that. But it's just in question of when it gets to actually delivery and what they've actually received and how that's measured and how that's managed, which feeds into everything else in terms of having the data on what's been delivered, supplier performance, predictions for the future, all that sort of stuff. I feel like that's where it falls down the most. I just wondered whether whether you'd agree with that.
I would, from a fundamental standpoint. Most of the Gen 1 clients and programs that we speak with initially, it's just getting that visibility and transparency to what's happening. And I liken it to the fact that procurement does this great job negotiating these large contracts. Well, then it goes over to operations, and operations is focused on sometimes different elements of it, right? In terms of getting the work done no matter what. And so some of those gains that were negotiated up front can get lost on budget overages, right? Or change orders and controls. And then there are elements that need to be enforced or controlled in terms of the workers. And again, not procurement's remit, but they need a steward to do it and to maintain it. So I think that's one of the initial value props, is to say, after I give this contract and you start executing it, how am I getting the value out of it? How am I maintaining the value that's there? So I think that's part of it. But I think the value prop can creep from there, is that once foundationally you have the information on suppliers that you're utilizing, service competencies, the geography coverage and things like that, then there's more of a role for a value prop. And it doesn't always have to be one step before the other. I always think that value is in the eye of the beholder and what the organization's ready for. We have clients that say, nope, I'm all in. I want the broader, fuller service, and I'm ready for the change that's going to come with it. It really just varies.
Yeah, and the thing is, you can take that all the way through right to genuine understanding of return on investment, but also broader topics like understanding the sustainability and innovation capabilities, potential levels within your supply chain, which is something I don't think really people, when it comes to services procurement, I don't think really people have much of a handle on that at the moment. They're probably missing out on innovation. Trending towards go-to suppliers, whereas if they get a program in place, they can create the right visibility, they can make much more informed decisions. But ultimately, it's about capturing the process, capturing the information, and being able to use that strategically rather than it just purely being a transaction.
And the other thing I would just add to, the other thing that we're seeing that's changing is, and it's related to COVID to some extent, and also the data breaches and privacy. People typically think, well, it's services procurement, I don't really need to worry about the worker, right? And where they are and things like that. That's changing. So like with some services procurement where the workers have to come on site, facilities management or other items like that, we're now hearing, because of the legislation in the US, that our clients or prospects are asking us about validating attestations of health screenings before they access the facilities. And now it becomes pretty important that when that worker is no longer accessing the client systems, right, you want them out, because you don't want them lingering in there and opening up a potential data breach. So that's the other shift I see, is that the back end or the transaction piece has value, and now the market's changing to make it even more valuable in some aspects.
Yeah, I think it was also the other thing that triggered me to talk about the kind of post-contract phase was when you mentioned about during COVID, some contracts getting cancelled. And I guess what you're kind of alluding to there was it's very difficult if you're not tracking delivery against what's been contracted effectively. It's very difficult to know where you are, because in that scenario, you're either started or finished, and there's kind of in between is a bit of a grey area, really, I guess.
Yeah. It can be on a time material engagement. It can be like an open checkbook, right? If you don't have the some sort of holdback or some sort of provision tied to that billing element, it just becomes very gray. And the world of Agile, right, preaches that, where it's not a waterfall deliverable. It's like Scrum and then complete, Scrum and complete. That environment can be challenging to put in that element of control.
Yeah, definitely. When people are working on that kind of iterative basis. Really, really interesting. Thanks for that. So Paul, over to you. What are you thinking? What are you seeing at the moment? And I'd just like to take a slightly different angle with this. Obviously, you've sat on within all the different camps. What do you think the market looks like based on the different angle of the different types of stakeholders that are involved?
I mean, fundamentally, I think there are two ways to look at your SOW workforce or service procurement workforce. You can look at it as a cost or a risk that's got to be minimized, or you can look at it as an asset that's got to be liberated and optimized. And I think if you look at it in a minimization way, that naturally leads you to a controlling type solution. You'll start with, how do we define the workers? You'll apply procurement rules. You'll then have a degree of constrained sourcing. You'll have frustrated people in the supply chain because they'll feel they're disengaged from the people who they're doing the work for. And then when it comes to the back end that we've talked about in terms of, the tracking, the paying, and the evaluating, it becomes much more transactionally centered. And I don't think those types of programs are sustainable beyond anything that may be causing short-term distress. So if a company's really hemorrhaging money, has got to suddenly make cost savings quickly, then of course you need some kind of control-based solution. But as a long-term sustainable program, it's got to be much more enabling. And this is where you start with the work. What do you want to get done? And then you have all manner of different options available to that end user. You're then creating facilitated sourcing that really encourages and incentivizes the supply chain to really work and offer you best value. And then the back end reflects reality. Projects do change. They need to flex. Scope isn't always properly understood at the start. And stakeholders change. Expectation change. Resources that you deck against a program will change. So you have to acknowledge that there's going to be natural fluidity. And so that needs to be built into that successful solution. And so I think, more and more as companies look at how they're getting work done, they need to be much more enabling in their mind. The other thing I would say as a general point is, we talk in the recruitment industry about the employer value proposition.
Yeah.
Well, I think from an SOW perspective, it's all about your customer value proposition. And you want to be that customer of choice. And with the best one in the world, if you just add cost of sale by introducing unnecessary steps and unnecessary hurdles, you're not going to make yourself the customer of choice. But if you create a smoother, simple way for the suppliers to deliver value and to showcase the value they can offer to you, then you're going to be much more of a honeypot for the best suppliers in industry, and that's where you get competitive advantage.
Yeah, it's such a great point. I mean, it's still part of the war for talent. If you're getting a supplier to deliver the service for you, or whether you're trying to hire somebody, or whether you're trying to get a contractor to do work for you. And I think that also ties into what I mentioned earlier around things like sustainability and diversity, and the culture of an organization, and how good a fit that is in terms of your ESG profile and fit when you look at supplier versus client. And it works both ways. So people want to work with the great companies, suppliers want to work with the great companies, and companies want to work with the great suppliers. So I think that's a really good point that you make there. And it's intelligent companies, forward-thinking companies are definitely starting to think like that. But it's interesting, the other point you made around the kind of need for fluidity and the natural kind of knee jerk for some companies to just want to exert control. I think what we're seeing is from a tech perspective, we're seeing a real balance between the need for really good, easy user interface and the ability to do self-serve. So you want to make life easier for the supplier as well. You want to make life easier for the buyer. And in some organizations, you might have a completely unmanaged scenario where it's just all happening and there's no real control over it. So therefore, there's a kind of a gradient to which you can move from complete self-service scenario through to a very heavily managed and controlled scenario. But in either one, if you've got a program in place, if you've got the right technology in place, then procurement can see what's going on. So either way, you get that massive win of creating the visibility. But I guess it kind of depends on the company culture, whether you've got a kind of mandate-driven culture, it's in a highly regulated industry, or whether it's in a culture where there's a lot more freedom. It comes back to value again, doesn't it? Because the service has got to deliver enough value to all parts of the process. So I would see that as buyer, supplier, and procurement stakeholders. What's your view on kind of where that sits at the moment in terms of what companies are willing to let stakeholders do by themselves, and on what the kind of appropriate level of control is seen to be?
Well, I think there's a difference between doing something which is rules-led and insight-led. And I think if you have a self-serve program which is insight-led, so I mean, an example, right? So you're creating a preferred supplier panel. Let's say you have 10 suppliers on there. They're all pre-vetted, pre-validated that they've got the expertise in particular areas. So a stakeholder internally wants to appoint someone to do a marketing project. Well, they may have used that supplier 3 times before, but they may not know that supplier has suddenly changed some of their key personnel, or that compared to the other validated options, they're the most expensive. And so what you're doing is, if you can present information to that end user at the point they're making a decision, then you can influence what they do. Now, if at the end of the day, it's their budget. So if they still want to appoint the most expensive supplier, that's their call, but you're giving them that validated choice from which to make that decision. And so I think the value of a program, and certainly a value of an organization like us, is to be able to offer those insights to that end user at the point they're making that decision. So you're bringing all of that together. On the rules basis, yes, you need really, lean, simple, effective workflow through the system. But that on its own isn't necessarily going to deliver the best value for an organization. You've got to inject insight into that process as well. In terms of your question into what types of organizations are doing this, well, if you look at the analyst information, that financial services and pharma are probably the sectors that are most advanced in their deployment of services procurement support from our part of the market. But there's a huge variety of levels of maturity and levels of ambition. And so to make a successful program, I think you need 3 things. One, you need obviously the workflow, the technology. You need the practical appreciation of what good looks like to then deliver insights into that process. But you also need stakeholders that are bold and ambitious enough to really grab the benefits that are there. And without those three things in place, it's hard to really do a standout program. But if you get those three ingredients, then you really, really can fly.
Yeah, I think one area that I find particularly fascinating is looking at the balance between the different stakeholders within an organization. When you start to look at this as what's the most effective use of all of my resources, how are my resources balanced, how are they structured, what are my different work delivery channels? How are you seeing that working at the moment, in the sense that, if you take services, you could view services procurement in kind of a couple of different ways. You could view it purely as this isolated, separate category, which to a certain extent it is. It's a unique and distinct category of service delivery, but as the kind of like right at the top level, you're looking at it as part of how you get work done within your organization, and you might decide to get some work done using this channel, you might get some work done using another channel. How are you seeing the different stakeholders interact? And by that I mean at the level of management of this sort of thing, procurement versus talent versus HR, and how they're kind of intermingling, but also how the C-suite are approaching it.
So I think first and foremost, the C-suite need to be made more aware of the opportunity that they're missing out on. I mean, there is this belief system that, going back to a point about, it's a minimization of cost and risk. And so they may be quite happy to have a strategic consultancy come in and talk to them about organizational design and organizational efficiency that requires an awful lot of the insight that you would get from a workforce solution provider such as ours. And so I think we have to do a better job at telling more strategic story and turning those data and the insights that we have into something which is much more meaningful to the C-suite. But I think more generally than that, I think it's a very easy thing to use as an excuse that procurement and HR don't talk to each other well enough, or a services isn't run within the contingent stakeholder hierarchy, and therefore nothing can get done. It's all about how do you really present the benefits to the organization. And if you present it in a way that is the reality, which is it's all part of the same ecosystem, it's just about different ways to actually achieve business results. And so you need to look at it as an entirety. Then I think you start to eliminate some of those tensions in functional perceptions, really, that actually cause so many of the delay. And so I think it's a road that will need to be walked down for another probably 2 to 3 years before people get a lot more comfortable in presenting that story. But it's got to be thought of. It's a business proposition.
Yeah.
It's not a procurement proposition or an HR proposition. It's a business proposition, and it leads to competitive advantage. And you've got to couch it in those ways to really grab the impact of the people that need to appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think it's a huge opportunity for procurement teams to get greater recognition and to achieve more kind of strategic power within organizations, because they're just going to be in control of so much data. We talked about insight-led, we talked about the information that this sort of thing is generating, these sort of programs, and using technology and a service to actually really lift the lid on what you're doing. That's powerful information. And I think, I've discussed this previously, but just procurement have so much information and they have so much access, because they're accessing suppliers. So they've got the external access. They know what's going on internally, but they also know what the external people think of what's going on internally and how they interact with it. And, they may understand some of the problems that are coming up internally. And so just this wealth of information, I think that's something that, as procurement move away from a more transactional based scenario to a more data-driven strategic opportunity, that just feeds in so nicely to the C-suite, where there's a pivotal point that procurement are controlling, that they can really help from a kind of top level organizational position. Scott,
sorry, John, I was going to say, I'm sure, Scott, you'll agree with me on this, but there is a difference between having the data and being able to tell a story. And I think that's one of the things that we really are trying to do, is to help tell that story not just present raw data.
Absolutely. So in our experience, it takes that defining what good looks like by someone who's seen it work successfully at other clients. And I think that's what we bring. And so if we can get access to their transaction data and also to some of their people that are managing the processes today, a specific business case or a solution can be scripted for that client. And it's funny, people know that they want a solution, but they're not sure how it's going to work, or they don't know specifically how it can function for them. And when we try to sell SOW, it's a complex concept. It takes several meetings and conversations to understand it. And your stakeholder needs to be able to explain it also as well in their organization. So it takes a lot to educate them. And then what we're finding is they need the help to build the business case. And so if you can get access to the data, like we were saying, and formulate, hey, this is what it could look like. This is information, or these are suppliers that are shared in other programs. This is how these types of SOWs can be structured and agreed to. I think that is defining what good looks like. And a good MSP partner should be willing to come in there and do that prescriptive service for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. It kind of ties into this whole chicken and egg scenario, because it's like you look at some of these clients and you sort of think, if you had a program in place and if you had any idea of A, what you're missing out on at the moment, B, the risks that you have and the stuff that could be going on that you're not aware of, and C, if you understood what it could look like in terms of the information you could utilize, you'd be steaming ahead with this right now. But it's sometimes hard for people to make that leap. That's certainly something that we've seen with customers that we're working with in the market. And interestingly, it's an area where we found that having technology as part of a solution, whether that's within a VMS or as a separate provision or standalone technology, is something that has really enabled that sales process, because a picture tells 1,000 words. And if people can actually look at a process and understand how something works in practice, clearly there's more to it just than that workflow, but being able to actually see how something will actually operate tends to set off kind of light bulbs in people's heads, certainly in my experience. But just on the subject of the tech side of things within the services procurement marketplace, Scott, what's your view on what that looks like at the moment and what the kind of strengths and weaknesses are of the current technology landscape in this area?
Yeah. So how much time do we have left? So typically within companies that use an ERP or procurement system, they're also using adjunct systems at the same time. So they may be using an HRS system along with a procurement system, along with some CRM for supplier management. That traditional approach doesn't work well in terms of an integrated environment. And that's one of the benefits of the vendor management systems that are out there. It brings together what I call the four elements. It's the worker, the contract, the invoicing, and the supplier performance. It's all integrated, that's in there. And so by having it in one microcosm and the fact that they're all interdependent, in terms of the rates that are in the SOW agreement are actually attached to the worker, and the invoices are attached to the max of that contract in terms of the sum. So having that environment, I think, is one of the bigger advantages. And from a strength perspective, most of the market leading VMSs are able to bring in the full cycle, right? You've got sourcing, contracting, all the way through invoice and settlement. So having that in one place is ideal. The pieces that I think are lacking in some of those systems today, for the contracting and the bid functionality, for the most part, it's pretty clunky from a user experience standpoint, and that it can function, but you need to know how it works, and it's not very intuitive, especially when you compare it to like other, like the Amazon experience, or even what I've seen with other VMSs where it's cleaner, it's interactive, it's guiding you. The VMSs need to learn that, I think, and invest in that. And what we've seen is that they're now opening up for integrations, right? Because they know other specialty providers have nailed this from a small perspective, and they're building in integrations because I think they're saying, look, we can't keep pace, or we're not up there, so our clients need a way to come in. And just two other points I'd make about where I think that they can improve is that it's so important to measure supplier performance. And it's not just when you're releasing a payment, but there are also service level agreements across the life of the engagement. There are sometimes also penalties in terms of them not hitting a certain milestone. The VMSs need to get better at that, because right now there are band-aids in terms of how to do it, and it needs to be a lot stronger. And then the last piece I'd say, well, we talked about it. I think the UI experience needs to get better overall, because it needs to be more intuitive, like the other systems that buyers are seeing today, in my opinion. Yeah,
really, really interesting. How about you, Paul? What's your view on the kind of tech landscape? How do you see it how do you see it now, and what do you think it will look like in 18 months, 2 years time?
Well, I mean, I always refer to Scott in terms of perspective on the VMS landscape. My view on tech is that I think it's inevitable that more and more elements of the end-to-end process can be supported by tech. But I think we've also got to recognise that the VMSs are geared towards large enterprises that have a lot of expenditure. Therefore, how do you support those organizations who are smaller, perhaps less mature, perhaps have less need for that kind of integrated offering? How you still want to buy services well. So I think there's a need for an appreciation of what you need for what type of use case. And then as you get more of an integrated requirement, then obviously, there are many, many options that you can consider. So I think that's one point. The second point is that whilst technology is a great thing, and I absolutely believe that we'll be much more powered by automated options, when it comes to a selection decision, you're still buying trust, you're still buying confidence, you're still buying empathy, you're still buying understanding of your requirement. And so I think technology will largely stick around the workflow element of the process. And I think that final buying decision, even down to filtering, because it's very hard for some strategy projects, for example, to be able to use technology to really filter the proposal that you're offering and the ingenuity that you're bringing to that requirement. So I think you have to acknowledge that there's going to be a part of the services buying cycle which always needs that interaction, that human interaction, because you're buying trust. Now, when it comes to defining the work, there's also increasing options out there for how do you help companies through that thought process. So I think that also is an area of the market where we're going to see being much more exciting and much more needed. And so stitching those things together, helping people to define their requirement, giving them the options, helping them through their logic, having that workflow that takes them through that sourcing and decision process. But there has to be a breakout point where technology we need to recognize the limitations of that in the buying process.
Yeah, it's an enabling part of the service as I see it. I mean, it's obviously for us as a pure tech provider, purely in the services procurement statement of work arena, something I'm really passionate about is the need for dedicated technology. I think when you're removing the compromises, you can go much deeper into it. And as this market grows, I think there will be more providers that probably come into the market that, again, are just pure play dedicated providers. There's always going to be, as Scott very rightly put it, the need for that integration, particularly at some of those very high level, very large programs, whether that's external suppliers integrating with existing systems or bigger systems that cover multiple areas. But just to pick up on a couple of other points you guys made that I think are quite interesting. Supplier performance, that's the sexy bit. That's the bit that's the kind of future panacea. That's the bit that drives all the real strategic, that's the future focus. And certainly for us with some of the stuff we're doing around supplier performance. But in light of what you said, Paul, about the workflows, you have to do the boring bit to get to the cool bit. And it's critical that you get. We talked about, usability and all that sort of thing. Totally agree with you, Scott. It's only as good as the adoption. But I think if you capture those workflows in the first place, most companies aren't doing that effectively at the moment. So that's a massive leap forward. But once you capture that information, if you do it effectively, it just opens up a whole world of possibilities around things like supplier performance and driving those insights. So
can I make a point, Johnny? I mean, I think you're right in terms of supplier performance being a really important part of the jigsaw. But I would go wider than that. I don't think it's just evaluating the performance of the supplier. I think it's evaluating the performance of the combination, because we all know how many suppliers are less productive than they could be because they're not given the environment to be productive inside their client organization.
It's return on investment.
That two-way learning is critical at the back end of a project.
Yeah, you're right. Ultimately, it's return on investment. That's the thing that people really need to understand. And like you say, if people are in the wrong environment, you might have a supplier that is really innovative, but if they're being grilled about little things and they don't have the right relationship, it's quite difficult to be innovative in that type of scenario where you're sitting in a quarterly business review and getting read the riot act. So just going back to one other thing that Scott mentioned earlier, which I think is a really relevant kind of broader point, and it'd be interesting to see how the technology landscape adapts to this. Obviously, you've got specialist providers that are purely dealing with outcome-based, services procured under a statement of work, for example. But this wider shift to outcome-based, for us as a tech provider in this area, it feels like the market's coming our way, which is great. But it's been a really interesting shift, and I think COVID has had a fair amount to do with it. You've got things like the gig economy that are driving it as well, where it's pieces of work being done. But also, I think COVID is just it's increased the understanding and recognition that a lot of this is happening already. But it's also increased the recognition that it's actually a very feasible way to get things done. If we look at that from a kind of a market perspective, what do you think have been the key drivers? I'll start with you, Scott. What do you think have been the key drivers in that kind of shift to outcome-based?
Yeah, so I think it's the two that we talked about earlier, right? Lessons learned from COVID about actually proving what you paid for in the case of default. And then the second one I really think is going to be the rate inflation of the workers. It's just going to force it that way. And then I think it becomes a more relative pay for performance control. Right. So if you think about it, if I'm tying my payment release to something that's tangible, I'm holding more of the cards. And so I think that control is something that is beneficial for the client. The thing is, they have to be more educated on the solution to do that. And so they have to be more involved. So it puts a little bit more onus on that, because you have to know what good is, right, in terms of what your supplier is delivering. And you have to be able to push back and structure the agreement properly. So there are big gains to be had. It just takes a little bit more onus, I think, on the buyer to know the product, know what's coming through, and structure it properly. At least that's what we're seeing in the industry so far.
Yeah, it makes sense. What about you, Paul? How do you see this being managed, particularly in the context of, I think traditionally some people would automatically view outcome-based service delivery as being more expensive than, for example, work being done under time and materials. Clearly, that's not necessarily the case, because it depends how long a team or somebody takes to do something. What are you seeing around that, just generally in terms of people's attitudes?
Well, it might make you laugh, but I think one of the biggest impacts of COVID has been you can't see people working.
Yeah.
I mean, how many projects are based around teams of consultants on the customer premise, working in site, and then all of a sudden you're not seeing that anymore. So you're much more, I guess, aware of, well, what are they doing? Are they working 100% on my project, or actually are they giving me 50% of the effort but charging me 100% of the day rate? So I think that's driven a natural review of, well, what am I really getting for what I'm paying? I think when it comes to the commercial model, I've always been fascinated with this conversation between time and materials and fixed price. There is such a thing as called a capped time and material commercial model, right? And so what you're doing is you need to equate the value that someone is actually giving to you and how they're calculated their fee. Now, if I'm going to go and paint a house, I'm going to work out how many days do I think it's going to take me to paint a house. I'm not going to do that and say, oh, I'm going to charge you however many thousands. I'm going to base it on a unit of time. But what I'm going to do is present that to you as a fixed price. So I'm giving you that surety. Now, I'm then taking a risk that, it might take me longer to paint the house, or actually I might be benefit because it's going to take me less time. But the judgment call isn't to just use that dimension of the commercial model. It's to say, well, am I paying for someone's effort, or am I paying for someone to give me something, deliver me something? And if you orchestrate whatever commercial terms you have around the giving of me something, that's when you're really thinking of on an outcome footing. But that whole idea of T&M, an SOW can't be based on T&M is one of the glorious misperceptions that I think has infected this area for years.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a divide between needing an individual and needing something to be done. The fact is, something being done is still going to take a certain amount of time of somebody with a certain expertise. But yeah, clearly it's a different way of pricing and delivering a service. But I think when you look at it through the lens of kind of employment tax law and some of the stuff we're seeing in the UK around the IR35 reforms, we're seeing in Germany around the AUG, I think it's AUG laws, and in the US 1099 versus W2, it's about whether it's an entity or an individual and kind of how that work's being delivered. So I think people get scared by the nuances of it. But when you boil it down to the simple practicalities, you make a good point. So what about the obstacles then? So there's clearly a huge amount to be gained. There's a much lower level of maturity in the adoption of these services, and probably just the general maturity of these services, and certainly the tech environment compared to traditional contingent workforce. But what would you see, and I'll start with you, Paul, what would you see as the main hurdles at the moment for just getting clients started with the program?
I don't have the data, and I don't have a remit, and I define things differently. Yep. So I might have a consultant and a contractor doing exactly the same work, but I treat them differently in my organization, and I call them something different. And all of these things are reasons not to do something. And that's when I talked about this, any solution that starts with a work definition is destined to disappear in a black hole, because it's artificial distinction. Now, yes, from a legal perspective, as you just said, Johnny, there are different ways of defining organizations and service providers. But when it comes to how they do work in an organization, it becomes, any permutation. And so, get back my marketing sample. I want someone to come in and do a marketing strategy for me. Okay, what's my choice? I have a multitude of different types of service provision, and there's a way of engaging those people. But I'm not going to start with, I use a consultant for marketing strategy rather than a contractor. Do you see what I mean? And I think that's the problem, where people get so hung up on definitions and the way things are internally counted that it creates inertia and just procrastination. I think the other thing that we find often is, because you're looking at different types of expenditure, and organizations are bound to be different in their levels of maturity around IT versus facilities or versus utilities. And what we need to do is say, well, how do you want to deal with those different types of spend, and have maybe a different throughput, a different level of pace and acceleration in terms of what you want to do there. But you don't want to do it in a way that means the customer has so many choices, they don't know where to start. So I think it's simplifying this fact of, what do you want to get done? Here are all the different options you can think about. The funnel is to use those options in the most compliant and accessible way. But your first decision is, what do I want to do? And then everything funnels from there.
Yeah. So again, this is something that I've certainly heard a lot and said a lot myself. It's about the work, not the worker. And that's got to be the start point. But I think also when you're talking about the kind of obstacles, it's interesting to hear, and I agree with you that they are definitely the things that I'm kind of hearing and come across within the market. There's the other side of it was this kind of mid-market factor, which also translates into, what about the big companies that don't want to do the whole thing in a big bang? And that's where I think there's some interesting opportunities for people to get started without the hurdle being too high, and without them feeling like it's a massive risk or it's a giant transformation. Whereas actually, for them to be able to go to the C-suite and get justification to do a giant program, they're better off starting by getting started.
Of course. I mean, every day of the week, Johnny, you're absolutely right. I mean, you Rome wasn't built in a day. So you've got to pick those areas of your need which you think you can get most benefited. And those are things which are often the most fragmented, or you have the widest potential supplier choice, or the things where that you end up with a lot of change control. So those are the things that you try and look for, because that bringing those things together in a coordinated fashion are going to deliver benefit to those end users. And I think it's not necessarily what are we spending most on, it's where are end users not getting the most value. And I think if you start there and then you're building on success, then you kind of lead up to something bigger. So yeah, you wouldn't ever sort of go all in one go.
And have you seen much success in kind of like pilots that maybe start in one geography and then move into other areas? Is that what you would expect to see? Or is it more a question of it's going to be within a particular division of an organization? It's more likely to be a particular burning pot of spend.
It is a depends answer. I mean, if you've got a global category lead, for example, they're going to probably want to do something that is you can benchmark, and so you will try and do something to a standard point. But it might well be that a particular geographical area dominates in terms of their use of a particular type of service provider or a different type of service. And so it really does all depend on where the opportunity is and what the profile of spend and usage looks like. Would you agree, Scott?
Yeah, I would. Oftentimes you'll just go after IT because it's usually the largest indirect category, and it's usually one that's centralized and can lend itself that way. But it does vary in terms of what the client is trying to secure and optimize and get the value out of the program. Is very much prescriptive on what needs to be put in place. The thing that has to be balanced on this, and I guess this is sort of the elephant in the room, there's the element of the implementation cost versus what's coming into the first scope. So a pilot can be great, but sometimes the implementation effort to put it and stand it up can be just as expensive as a bigger one. Not in all cases, but it's just something that needs to be factored from a cost versus return perspective. And usually what we like to try to do is say, let's not make it a pilot. Let's just make it phase one, right? We're going to structure this agreement. We're going to go after all these other categories. We're going to start with this one, but it's not, we're going to stop and pause. It's the mindset that we're going and we're just going to use this one as sort of the proof of concept, but it really it's, step one to step two.
Yeah, it makes sense. And Scott, from your side, what do you see other than what Paul's just described? Would you agree with that with regards to the hurdles that there are that really are stopping clients from getting started at the moment or getting in the way of that?
Yeah, I agree with all of them. And I think we may have talked about this earlier. It's educating your client on what the offering can be and what they want. So it's getting in the door and articulating it, and you have to teach the solution. And then the other thing, and I think Paul, you may have mentioned this, is that there are different decision makers in this process, right? There's not one owner of SOW, and I'm quoting your line, Paul, is that it's spread across different functions and organizations. So you have to find out what the value prop is for whoever you're getting an audience with, right? For HR, it could be those worker compliance things that I talked about earlier, other pieces. So it's about getting a groundswell, right? When you're selling it, you've got to figure out, okay, who am I getting access to, and where can I get a groundswell across multiple points in the organization? And I think when you figure that out, and if you're getting access to those people and their data, then I think it's a recipe for success.
Yeah, absolutely. So one last thing I wanted to kind of cover off before we wrap things up was geographical changes. So Scott, in terms of the trends you've seen from a geographical basis, I mean, I would, my personal opinion is that the US is ahead of certainly the UK and Europe when it comes to generally using statement of work on a fairly sophisticated level, partly because some of the legislative processes that are already in place in the US, and just it's a bit more, it feels a bit more like it's a bit more a common way of getting things done. Would you agree with that? And what sort of geographical trends are you seeing within customers?
Yeah, for sure. We see it. The US is just the more mature market, and it has been, but we're seeing expansion grow outside in EMEA and APAC. And what we're seeing is our clients that we have already in the US, they're now adding the pieces, right? We start with the US and now we're adding those pieces. So it's incremental adds of an existing, national client. I think with IR35 prep, it's raising more attention. It's making people think about proper work arrangements. So I think that's driving more interest that we're seeing in the proposals. And we're seeing it more and more in terms of requests to bring it in. And it'll get there for sure. And with APAC, we really haven't seen much, but now we're starting to hear, like within Australia and New Zealand, that there's a groundswell coming. It's small, but it should be coming over time. So I think it's just a matter of time and maturity when those markets will just, they'll grow organically.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look at some of those external factors like the IR35 reforms and like things like COVID, but also like, big changes like Brexit. That's going to cause and already is causing significant skill shortages to compound the existing skill shortages that you already have in places like the UK. So that's definitely kind of things like that definitely push the agenda. And I would expect certainly with like the kind of IR35 type legislation, I'd expect that to be more of an issue globally as we progress. What's your take on that, Paul, in terms of the kind of geographical trends and changes that you've seen?
I'd agree with both of you, what you just said. I mean, I think the US definitely, it's a more natural part of a program, but that is now becoming less of an exception, in other parts of the globe. But organizations will work at different paces. And I think if you take EMEA, there are so many different individual countries, that you need to bear in mind from a legislative point of view. It's not easy to kind of piece everything together as a single track solution. So I think it's complexity breeds how quickly you can go. I don't think there's a lack of intent. I think it's just about the practicalities of how do you roll these things out across the entirety of your program of state. But that's part of our job, it's to help educate, as Scott was saying, and to give people that roadmap that they can feel comfortable is achievable. So
talking about roadmaps and taking things forward, just to kind of wrap up the conversation, Scott, what are your kind of key predictions for what you expect to see happening in this market over the next kind of 6 months and then the next kind of 12 to 18 months?
Yeah. So as I said before, I think outsourced services buying will just continue to be a large portion, and the market is definitely going to be there. I think more clients are going to want more consultative support. Procurement is being asked to do more with less. I think they're going to look for providers and technologies that can help with that piece. So I think that's going to be a growing market for MSP providers like us. And then the third piece, contract AI. And so I really think there is a groundswell that will be coming in terms of intelligent technology that can help that SOW creator guide them towards the proper SOW construct. And then the second piece is the element of the contract itself is that, and it's so interesting, right? A lot of our clients will still do Microsoft Word for legal. It's this thing that,
Yeah.
For drafting the contracts, legal just can't get their hands off of it. So there's always going to be some element of contracts that are pre-negotiated. They're on Word or PDFs. That's, I think, the other piece of AI is that I think there'll be even more focus on assessing the risk that are in existing contracts and using that to manage it. So like Paul said, I don't think it's going to replace the human factor and the decision factor. It's just going to be another tool that a services procurement provider will use to provide additional value.
Really interesting. I like that. How about you, Paul? What's your, if we get the kind of crystal ball out, what do you what are your predictions?
Well, I mean, I agree with everything that Scott said in terms of the technology. I think there's going to be some paradigm breakages going on. I think the classic perception is that a services procurement program has to be initiated by procurement. So I think that's going to break. I think organizations are going to see that there is a business need, and procurement functions are going to be critical stakeholders, but they won't always be the ones that will initiate this particular need. And it's going to be HR that I think will take more of a dominant involvement. But I also think transformation programs organizationally are going to start to look at this as being an opportunity to deliver value. I also think that this whole idea of it's a cost driven solution. We've got to get away from that. It's all about increasing value and perceived value to whoever is that end client. So I think, and I hope that that's going to really start to become more of the default mentality. And I think the third thing is that it's really about your bravery. Organizations need to push past some of this. It's too hard, therefore I'm not going to do anything. Every organization on the planet spends money on services, and every organization on the planet wants to do it well, because if they do it well, that's going to help them become more competitive in the market. So I think you have to push past this it's too difficult to it's something that of course we should want to do. Let's find the best way to do it. And I think those are the paradigm shifts which I hope in 2 to 3 years time we'll start to see a real shift in.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, when you mentioned the point about value, that's certainly echoed in conversations I have with, for example, chief procurement officers, chief financial officers, who want to address this with value-based decisions rather than cost-based decisions. And when you talk about programs being initiated by different stakeholders within organizations, I think that's something that's probably already starting to happen, but procurement is still obviously sitting very centrally within that. I think my main prediction for all of us is that we're going to be very, very busy indeed.
I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great time to be focused on this market. There's a huge amount of growth and a huge amount of opportunity. And I think, like you say, where there's this getting past this, it's too hard. Sometimes stuff just comes along that just forces companies to make a change, and that could be a regulatory change. It could be a global level change like COVID, various factors of which there are multiple going on at the moment. So I think it's for me, I see it as a kind of a pivotal time in the way that the market's shifting. So yeah, no doubt we will be very busy indeed over the next couple of years. But listen, guys, we'll wrap things up there. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. It was a fascinating discussion. Great to get your insights. And yeah, I look forward to seeing how things pan out over the next few months. Wish you guys all the best with everything. And yeah, let's stay in touch and maybe have another conversation along these lines at some point in the near future.
Great conversation. Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Johnny.
Superb. Cheers, guys.
All right.